purpose of life and ethics and values and who is Jesus and what makes Jesus divine, but it really boils down to table manners. That's what we argue about in church. If you don't believe me, just follow along in the Gospels and see how much controversy surrounds dinner. Jesus and his disciples, in the very beginning of Mark, were out picking grain on the Sabbath because they were hungry. The Pharisees came along and said, "Hey, you can't do that. It's the Sabbath." And Jesus said, "Well, we weren't made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for us." And that made the Pharisees so angry, they wanted to kill him. Eating is serious business. Martha got angry at Mary at dinner because she thought she wasn't helping enough. Another dinner problem. Jesus ate with a bunch of people who were considered sinners, and that got him in hot water. And of course we have the Last Supper, where Jesus announces that he's going to die and Judas is his betrayer. You know, inviting Jesus to dinner isn't the recipe for a pleasurable evening, apparently. The Bible is deadly serious about eating. You know, if we go back to the Old Testament and the Levitical codes, there are pages and pages of dietary restrictions. Don't eat animals with a cloven hoof, like pigs. Don't eat shellfish. Don't eat a lamb boiled in a mother's milk, which does sound pretty sensible. That sounds kind of gross. But these were very serious. In fact, they weren't just good habits. It was considered an abomination to do these things, punishable by death. That's pretty serious, isn't it? I mean, that was even before the writer of Leviticus had seen a baconator sandwich, right? That, you know, really couldn't kill you. I mean, you're taking your life into your own hands when you go through the drive-through window there. But they were very serious about these codes. And if we look at religious practices, the whole Jewish calendar revolved around feast days. Feast of Pentecost, or Passover, or Sukkot. These were the major religious holy days, were the feasts. And that's why we gather, to be at the table, to take the Eucharist together. I mean, we sing every Sunday, "This is the feast of victory for our God." The great holy moments are the Eucharist and coffee hour, right? Our sacraments. And if you think it's just a ritual, and it's really not all that important, try changing it. Right? For example, if I said this morning, you know what? Relax. Stay in your pews, and we'll bring communion to you. You don't need to come up here at the rail. That wastes a whole lot of time and energy. We'll do it like the Congregationalists. I'll bring it out to you. Now, I think I know the topic of tomorrow's church council meeting if I did that. Right? You don't change stuff like this. It's very important, isn't it? Or go to one of the Catholic churches in town. Read the bulletin somewhere around the communion service, and it'll somehow say in a very nice way, you know, you're welcome here, you can pray with us and you can listen, but if you don't believe our stuff, don't eat our food. Right? And we Protestants are no different. You know, it took Lutherans and Calvinists 500 years to recognize each other's communion. We get very defensive about this table up here, don't we? And while I may disagree with a closed table or creating divisions, I do recognize that when we eat together, we're on sacred ground. It's holy to eat together because you don't just do it with anybody, do you? Sitting, eating, breaking bread is an fed by God, to be fed in community. That was a core practice that Jesus wanted his followers to do. That's why he said, the kingdom of God is like a great banquet. All are invited. Bring the leper, bring the lame, bring the poor, rich and poor, bring everyone in. The kingdom of God is like a great banquet, a feast. And we recognize that every Sunday. Now that's all prologue here to Peter's problem. So here's Peter, the leader of the early church, and imagine trying to organize a potluck supper. You have Jews and Gentiles, and they can't eat together. They don't eat the same food, and not only do they have dietary codes and restrictions, you just can't eat with anybody. You couldn't eat with somebody outside of your own religion and culture. Many of the early church converts were Gentiles. And you know what? They liked shrimp scampi and glazed ham. They saw nothing of an abomination in that. It tasted good. Why not? And so here's Peter and Paul, and they have Gentiles and they have Jews, and they're all coming in because they love the message of Jesus, and you can't even have a potluck together. Big problem. The Jewish Christians wanted the Gentiles to follow their kosher dietary laws and also to be circumcised. And the Gentiles really didn't like either one very much. It's really a question of what is the early church going to be? Was it going to be a church dominated by one culture, by one clan and nation, and maybe a few people that would convert to their practices? Or was it going to be a global, multicultural, open place where Jew and Gentile can come together? Everything about the future of Christianity is at stake in the question of eating together. Peter struggled with this. At first, Peter would not eat with Gentile Christians. He preached to them, but he wouldn't sit at the table with them. And we have to understand, Peter is fighting against some powerful cultural forces. For at least a century, Jews had been struggling against Hellenization, Greek and Roman culture. That Rome was trying to make them into a good colony that was, following along with them and kind of in line with the Roman Empire, and they were resisting that. And often the only way they had to resist was keeping their tradition, keeping their practices, keeping the way they ate, keeping those codes. That was so important. It was the only way they could keep their hearts from being conquered by the Romans who had already conquered their land. In fact, the whole Pharisee program was that if they could keep the codes, if they could be pure and faithful to them, then God would come and favor Israel again and throw off the Romans. So there was a lot at stake in challenging these dietary restrictions in the Levitical code in getting the early church together. I mean, from Peter's first bite